Winter's cold grasp had finally let go of Thomas's branch line, and with the spring came a great deal of work for the quarry. Mavis was busier than ever, filling trucks with stone and then shunting them into their proper sidings. And when she wasn't busy in the quarry, she was taking trains to FarawayQuarry. "I should be grateful I'm working again," she said to Toby, "but I could really use a rest." Toby chuckled. "Well, I'm sure it'll wind down soon, but until then you best keep those trucks in order." Toby was right. After being cooped up in the quarry all winter, the trucks were restless and eager for an opportunity to play their tricks again. One day, they pulled Mavis under the hopper. Another time they slipped on their brakes as she tried to pull them to FarawayQuarry. Mavis was being put to the test. Even her harshest tactics made the trucks more mischievous. "That's enough!" she barked, giving them a dreadful lump. "That's no way to treat us," they muttered darkly, and whispered amongst themselves. Later that day, Mavis was arranging a long line of trucks to take to FarawayQuarry that evening when Toby arrived with some empties. "Are you planning on taking that many trucks?" he asked worriedly. "Oh, don't worry," smiled Mavis. "They've been on their best behaviour all day, thanks to me. It'll be a cakewalk." This didn't ease Toby's worries. "Did you know that there was an engine who used to work in the quarry before you?" "Yes," said Mavis. "What's that got to do with any of this?" Toby sighed and began his tale. "Back when this line was run by coffee pots, one of them used to work here. His name was Enofa, and he sometimes got a bit too big for his wheels. One night he took too many trucks. They pushed him down the tramway and he crashed just before the top station." Toby paused. "Not much of Enofa was recovered, but some nights workmen say they can hear his brakes screeching down the tramway, trying to stop his train, but he never does." Without another word, Toby went to shunt his trucks, leaving a speechless Mavis behind. Mavis remained silent for most of the day. "That story can't be true. Can it?" she thought. "Toby's not the sort of engine to pull a fast one like that. But I've never heard that story before." Soon, the daylight burned off, and a full moon shone down over the quarry. Mavis had just shunted the last trucks in front of her train. The train was long. It almost blocked the quarry entrance. The trucks giggled to each other as Mavis coupled up. "We'll do it at the gradient." Mavis slowly crept along the tramway. She jumped at the slightest sound or movement. There's no such thing as ghosts. There's no such thing as ghosts. There's no such thing as ghosts. Unfortunately, she became so distracted by Toby's story she forgot to check the trucks. "Now!" shouted the leader as 20 loaded stone trucks surged against Mavis. "Oh, help!" she cried as her brakes squealed along the rails. The train quickly gathered speed as they rocketed down the tramway. On, laughed the stupid trucks. "Oh, help! Help!" wailed Mavis once more as the train sped through the crossing. Then, Mavis felt something push against her front buffers, and sounds of brakes screeching filled the air. Suddenly, the train began to slow down. The trucks pushed as hard as they could, but Mavis was holding them now. As the train approached FarawayQuarry, Mavis felt the weight come off her buffers, and she brought the trucks safely into the yard. "Are you all right?" asked Toby. "You sound like you were in great danger." "I was," panted Mavis. Then she smiled. "But I made it in one piece, thanks to a little bit of help." Following the incident, the trucks wisely decided not to give Mavis any more trouble. "She's stronger than she looks," they would warn each other. "She stops 20 of us with no trouble at all." They, of course, didn't know what really happened, but Mavis did. As a token of thanks, she always gives a friendly toot whenever passing the place where Anova had his accident. Soon, many noticed that Anova's ghost was no longer around. But Mavis knows that he is at rest, having finally been able to stop a runaway after so many years.
This video is not made for kids. It is for older fans and adults only, so fuck off and enjoy the video.
Bear had settled into his new life on the island of Sodor. He was a hard worker and was quick to win favor of his fellow engines. Some had been weary of him. He was a diesel after all, and many of the engines disliked him. But with Henry's support, Bear was soon a firm member of the family. One day, as Bear was passing over the viaduct, a sharp gust of wind blew around him. He was so surprised his engine growled out. He mentioned it to Henry when they next met. "The wind on that viaduct is something else," he said. "It feels as if it means to blow an engine off of it." Henry chuckled, remembering Gordon and his dome, before his mind wandered further back. "You know, there's a legend about that viaduct." "What legend?" "It's quite an old one," murmured Henry. "Not many engines know it. It's practically as old as the viaduct itself. I only knew it as I was one of the first engines on the railway." "Can you please tell me about it?" "Very well," said Henry, and this is the story he told him. "Many, many years ago, as the railway was being built, there became a need for a large viaduct to be built. The men set about the task and were building it in record time. There was, however, one man who seemed displeased with his job. He grumbled dreadfully, as he was an all-around bitter and unpleasant fellow. One day, however, when the construction was just over halfway complete, it happened. It was a dark day. Wind threatened the entire operation. Eventually, the men were called back for fear of an accident. They all returned to safety, except for one. The bitter man didn't come back. He never did. Ever since that fateful day, he seemed to have vanished into the mist. Some say he fell off, perhaps due to the wind, or just by a sad accident. Others, however, claim he was pushed into the viaduct itself and was sealed away within the brick confines, where he remained until his unfaithful end. But his spirit lives on and haunts the bridge. They say whenever the wind blows, you can hear him crying out, seeking revenge on the person who crossed him. "You," he cries, "you did this to me." "It's just a story, of course," finished Henry. "One told to cheeky little engines in the hopes of keeping them in line. It didn't really work, of course, and eventually fell into legend. But that's the story of the viaduct." Henry hadn't meant to spook Bear with his story, but what neither he nor any of the other engines realized was that Bear was rather afraid of the supernatural. The poor diesel soon became deathly afraid of the viaduct. Whenever he rumbled over it, he wanted to go as fast as he could. Often thought he saw things out of the corner of his eye. Nothing there, nothing there. I'm just seeing things, he told himself. But he dreaded the viaduct all the same. However, after a few days, he began to relax a little. Until one night, he had to take the midnight goods. The journey started out well. It was a quiet night. The moon lit up the empty sky. Bear was enjoying himself. But he had just passed Merrin when the legend of the viaduct came creeping back into his mind. Oh no, he wailed. I'm to pass it. I must be quick. I must be. Oh, thank goodness it's quiet tonight. Bear was still nervous, but tried to be brave. However, as he rolled onto the viaduct, there was a sudden gust of wind. Oh! Bear cried as he drew to a stop.
We'd better phone for help,
muttered the driver. But Bear didn't hear him. No, not me. It wasn't me, trembled the diesel. But the wind kept on. Stop it! Bear wept and pleaded. It wasn't me. I didn't hurt you. No! Not me! No! Stop!
Are you all right, Bear?
Asked Donald.
I come to help rescue you, but you seemed dead to the world when I arrived. It's as if you fainted.
No, I just fell asleep, stuttered Bear.
Your driver said he thought you were greeting out.
Oh, I must have been snoring, blurted Bear. I've been feeling very tired recently.
You've been working yourself solid, that's for sure. Hope you're feeling better soon, Bear.
And with that, Donald puffed away. Bear didn't have a peaceful night. He didn't sleep a wink and seemed afraid of the brick wall of the nearby shed. He was glad when the sun finally rose. Bear never told any of the other engines what he saw that night. He doesn't think any of them would believe him. But he swears he wasn't hallucinating. He really did see what he saw. He doesn't like the viaduct anymore, and always hurries over it whenever he passes. Bear never wants to experience his night of torment again. For his sake, I hope he never does. Don't you?
This video is not made for kids. It is for older fans and adults only. So fuck off and enjoy the video.
On a cool summer evening, Daisy ventured down the branch line on her last journey of the day. Save for the hum of her engine, there wasn't a sound to be heard. She rounded the bend towards Hackenbeck Tunnel and tooted cheerfully at the Kindleys, who smiled and waved as they sat out front their little cottage. "You know," she said, backing down next to Toby at the sheds, "I've traveled up and down the branch line too many times to count, but I never tire of seeing the Kindleys." "I couldn't agree more," smiled Toby. "But you know, there was a time I dreaded going by that little cottage." Daisy was most surprised. "What? You don't mean to tell me you were frightened of dear Mrs. Kindly? She doesn't have a bad bone in her body," she scoffed. "Oh, heavens no," chuckled Toby. "It wasn't Mrs. Kindly I was afraid of. It was something else." Toby was grateful to have a new lease on life. Since coming to the island, he'd met many friendly people, and the scenery along Thomas's branch line put him in mind of his old tramway. His favorite place on the line was the Kindleys' cottage. Mrs. Kindly was in good health during this time, and she and her husband were often gardening as Toby passed. When he rang his bell, they waved back and called, "Hello." Toby always felt happier after seeing the Kindleys. It was ironic that Toby's favorite place on the line was followed by his least favorite, the Hackenbeck Tunnel. It wasn't particularly long or dark, but as he passed through it, Toby couldn't help feeling uneasy. He tried his best to brush it off. Bringing it up to Thomas only led to teasing. One afternoon, Toby was bringing stone from the quarry to the top station. As they came down the line, the familiar cottage came into view, and Toby rang his bell at the waving couple. Then he plunged into the tunnel. Toby grew nervous. Somehow, he felt he wasn't alone in the tunnel. "Ouch!" came a cry from his cab. His brakes screeched on as he exited the tunnel, stopping in the daylight. His fireman jumped down from the cab and paced beside the line. He was clutching his hand, a pained look on his face. The driver got down. "What's happened?" he asked. "I was shaping Toby's fire," winced the fireman, "when a piece of coal flew out of the firebox." He uncovered his hand, revealing an angry burn. "I'll see if the guard has a first aid kit," said the driver. "No," said the fireman sharply. "I'll be fine. Let's just get to Tidmouth. I'll tend to it there." As they set off again, Toby felt bemused, guilty, and upset. They arrived at Tidmouth to find James waiting for the stone trucks. "You're late," he snapped. "No wonder your little tramway closed, if this is how you dawdle about." Toby fumed. "It wasn't my fault," and he explained what happened. James just laughed. "Well, I've had my share of bad coal, but to spit it out in disgust? That's something new." And he puffed away, chortling to himself. "Don't let him get to you, old boy," said the fireman. Toby glanced at the fireman's bandaged hand. "I'm so sorry, sir," he said hastily. "In all my years of service, I've never had anything like this happen." The fireman chuckled. "No need to fret, Toby. It's nothing serious. Should heal in a matter of days. In the meantime, I'll have to work on my reflexes in case this happens again." Toby smiled, but still felt very guilty. A few days later, Toby was making a return journey to Farquhar with Henrietta and Elsie, the luggage van. Gray skies loomed ahead, and distant thunder rumbled across the valley. "Nasty weather," grumbled Elsie. "Whoever wants to be out on a day like this?" "Just you be thankful we've got any work to do at all," replied Henrietta. "Better than being someone's chicken coop." Toby laughed, but his smile disappeared as the tunnel came into view. The dark skies made it hard to see to the end. As Toby puffed through, a huge crack of lightning came down, illuminating the inside of the tunnel. "Goodness!" gasped Toby. In the flash, he thought he saw a young man leaning against the tunnel wall. Then, ouch! And the brakes came on. Toby stopped, his buffers just peeking out of the tunnel. The fireman stomped out. "Ridiculous!" he shouted. "Another backblast!" Sure enough, there was a small red welt on his hand. Mrs. Kindly came down from the cottage. "Come out to the house, dearie," she said to the fireman. "We'll bandage you up." The driver pulled the train out of the tunnel, while the guard explained the situation to the passengers. Mr. Kindly came out too. "Weather got you down, Toby?" he asked. "No, sir. It's something else." Toby told him everything. You say you saw a young man in the flash of lightning?" quizzed Mr. Kindly. "Yes, sir," said Toby, "but he just stood there. He made no attempt to avoid us." Mr. Kindly's face fell. "Oh dear," he sighed. "Maybe he is still there after all." Toby was puzzled. Who, sir?" Mr. Kindly took a deep breath and began. "I remember back when this branch line was being built. A crew of young workers had been sent to dig a tunnel through the hill. They were all wonderful boys, but I remember Clive the best. He always knew the best way to get a laugh out of you. The missus and I made good friends with those boys, and we often had them in on their lunch breaks, or had them stay for dinner when the day's work was done. One day, a storm was raging. Clive had gone into the tunnel to make sure the supports were secure. One of the workers was about to go join him. Suddenly, there was a crack and a shout, "Get out of the tunnel!" The next thing I knew, dust and dirt came pouring out of the tunnel mouth. The boys were frantic, and we started to dig away at the dirt as quickly as we could, but..." He trailed off, composing himself. "Clive didn't make it. The boys couldn't deal with what had happened and resigned. They had to hire a new team to finish the tunnel. I believe Clive is still in there, though." "You do?" Toby asked. Mr. Kindly nodded. "Sometimes, when I'm out in the garden, I can hear the sound of shovels digging away at the earth. Often I'll hear, 'Morning, Mr. Kindly,' from within the tunnel. I always run down to check, but there's never anyone there. You know, Toby, I think Clive may be the one behind your incidents." "Well, I do wish he'd stop," Toby sighed. "My fireman might resign if this nonsense keeps up." "Believe it or not, Toby, I don't think it's happening out of spite," said Mr. Kindly. "Clive enjoyed a bit of fun, but would never wish harm on anyone." He paused impressively. "I think he's trying to tell you something." "But why me? Thomas has never had anything odd happen in the tunnel." Mr. Kindly paused. "Young Thomas has a good heart," he said, "but he's still rather, naive. I believe Clive is reaching out to a wiser, more experienced presence. And that's you, Toby." Just then, the fireman came out of the cottage with Mrs. Kindly. "Good as new," he said to Toby. "Thank you, ma'am." Mrs. Kindly smiled. "Oh, do take care now. Let's not make this a habit, eh, Toby?" Toby smiled, but couldn't find the strength to laugh. As the train set off again, Mr. Kindly gave Toby a sympathetic look, then turned to the tunnel and sighed. "What's the matter, dear?" Mrs. Kindly asked. "Oh, just a bit of reminiscing is all," he replied. Toby was lost in thought. He could hear Elsie grumbling as they trundled along, but he didn't pay much attention. Elsie grumbled quite often, and he and Henrietta had learned to tune it out. But at the station, the guard called for Toby's crew. "Have a look at this, lads!" They were amazed to see a large dent on Elsie's roof. "Paying attention now, are you? No one heard me in the tunnel, and you ignored me all the way here. Nasty old tunnel. Poor old Elsie," she wailed. "Something must have fallen from the roof," pondered the guard. "We'll take a look next time we go through." That was enough for Toby. First his fireman, and now Elsie. "No more of this," he said to himself. He was determined not to let some ghost bring harm to his friends. Late that afternoon, the rain bucketed down. The crew kept dry under Tidmouth Station's roof. Toby sat silent, the rain running down his sides. "Rain doesn't usually upset you," worried Henrietta. "It isn't the rain," Toby replied. "I'm thinking of what Mr. Kindly said. Do you really think the tunnel could be haunted?" Henrietta was pensive. "I've seen many things in my time," she went on, "but the paranormal is something I can't quite put my wheels on." "I worry what will happen next time we go through that tunnel," continued Toby. "My back blast? Elsie being damaged? What if something happens to you?" "I'll be fine," Henrietta smiled. "You worry about getting your work done." The crew came to ready Toby for his next run. As they set off, Henrietta tried to be brave, but secretly she was a little nervous. As they journeyed down the branch line, the rumbling thunder shook the rails. Toby couldn't tell if it was the thunder or fear which made his wheels tremble. At Kindly Cottage, Toby rang his bell and gulped. The tunnel mouth came into view. "Here we go," he said to no one. Elsie kept on grumbling, but Henrietta remained in silent anticipation. At once, darkness enveloped the train. Save for Toby's puffing, all was silent. "Help!" Toby's brakes screeched on, and still in the tunnel, he ground to a halt. "What's going on?" he asked. "You've left us behind!" Henrietta's voice echoed. The guard jumped down from Henrietta's veranda and pulled out a flashlight, shining it at the front coupling. "The chain is still intact!" he gasped. Toby's crew, who had come back to look, were puzzled. They examined Toby's coupling hook and found nothing amiss. "What on earth?" began the driver, scratching his head. "Look!" shrilled Toby. His lamp shone to the tunnel's exit. It seemed as though something was piled on the tracks. The guard and crew walked up to the tunnel mouth and shone the flashlight. "It's soil!" At that moment, the fireman felt something fall on his cap. The men looked up. The soil above the tunnel was shifting. "The rain must have loosened the earth and is causing it to shift down the slope," the guard concluded. "We'll have to get back in the tunnel!" called a frantic voice. The men leaped back inside just as the earth gave way, crashing down onto the rails and blocking Toby's view. Everyone was astonished. The guard broke the silence. "We must go back to the station and let them know what's happened. Let's get out of here before we risk getting stuck for good." The crew agreed and began walking back to Toby's cab. "Thanks for the warning, old boy," said the driver, patting Toby's buffer. "You certainly saved our backs. I'd say this more than makes up for the burns." But, stammered Toby, "I didn't say anything." As he reversed, his lamps caught the shape of a young man leaning against the tunnel wall. Toby smiled knowingly. "Thank you," he said. Clive tipped his cap, walked towards the barricaded exit, and disappeared. The rain subsided, and within the week, workmen had repaired the tunnel. Toby had no further incidents following the repairs, and felt better about going through the tunnel. He knew Clive never meant to harm anyone, He was only trying to get someone's attention to prevent a greater tragedy from occurring. Toby always rings his bell as he exits the tunnel, for both Clive and the Kindlies to hear. It was the tram engine's special way of saying thank you to the ghost of the tunnel.
Percy had just finished helping to build the harbor on Thomas's branch line. "A fine job indeed," said the Fat Controller. "Would you like to stay and take care of the goods trains on the branch?" "Oh, yes, please, sir," smiled Percy. One of Percy's first jobs was running a post train in the evenings. He would collect letters and parcels from the harbor at the big station, delivering them to places along the branch. Of course, Percy's rails couldn't take him everywhere. A young postman named Tom Tipper met him at the end of the line and drove his post van to the villages and towns nestled deep in the Sodor countryside. Percy liked Tom. He always seemed to have a smile on his face. But one morning, Percy found Tom looking rather puzzled. "Something the matter, Mr. Tipper?" he asked. "Percy, did you notice anything strange at the harbor last night?" he asked. Percy pondered for a moment. "Nothing comes to mind, sir. Well, unless you count the smell of Henry's fish," he chuckled. Tom didn't laugh. "This doesn't make any sense," he muttered. Percy's smile fell. "What's the matter?" "My chief got a complaint from a very angry woman this morning. She received a letter from her husband. Impossible, she says, as he died into war. She thinks it's a prank and is blaming us. The chief isn't happy. He thinks I had something to do with it. I only just got this job, Percy. I can't bear to lose it to someone's sick idea of a joke." "I promise we'll get to the bottom of this, Mr. Tipper. I'll let you know if I see anything unusual at the docks tonight." Finally, Tom broke a smile. "Thank you, Percy. You're a very good friend indeed." With that, Tom turned and headed back to his van. Percy thought about Tom's dilemma all day. He tried to think of something, anything, that might explain what happened, but sadly, nothing came to mind. That night, a low fog hung over the harbor. Percy could barely see the rails in front of him, but all the same, he kept watch for anything peculiar. The fog played on his mind, giving the cranes and ships an ominous feeling. Percy looked to the platform. A man was standing right beside him. Percy jumped in fright. The man was quite pale and dressed in old-fashioned clothes. He looked very sad and weary. "Hello, sir," Percy whispered. The man said nothing. Percy plucked up courage. "Are you lost, sir? I'm very sorry, but the last passenger train left hours ago." The man shook his head. Then he held out his hand to Percy. He was clutching a letter. "Oh," Percy beamed. "You've got post to send. I'm sure my driver would gladly—" The man shook his head and thrust the letter at Percy. "Oh, I couldn't take it myself, sir. Your letter would fly right off me, and that would never do. If you put it in my vans, I'll make sure it gets delivered." Still looking sad, the man dropped his arm and headed towards the vans. Percy frowned. That was certainly peculiar, he thought. Soon the guard's whistle blew, and he set off into the night. "Percy!" Percy jolted awake and found the Fat Controller, Tom Tipper, and two women standing in front of him. The older woman angrily clutched two letters in her hand. "I'm sorry to wake you, Percy," the Fat Controller said, "but we've a very urgent matter to attend to. I'd like to introduce you to Mrs. Winifred Perry," she interjected.
And I'll thank you to remember that. Now listen, she said, pointing right at Percy. My husband didn't die in the war to become part of some tasteless joke.
Calm down, Mum, said the younger woman. There's no proof this engine and his crew are behind this.
No proof they aren't, either, my dear Jane, sniffed Mrs. Perry. Now, I want to get to the bottom of this.
The fat controller recovered. Now, Percy, if you know anything about this, it is of the utmost importance that you tell us.
As a matter of fact, sir, he replied, I did see something odd at the harbor last night.
He recounted the previous night with the mysterious man. His crew, who had been readying him for work, listened with interest. You're sure he walked back to the vans, Percy? His driver asked. I didn't see anyone else on the platform when we left. Percy felt an accusing glare from Mrs. Perry. Hold on, Percy, interrupted Tom. You said he wore old-fashioned clothes and looked quite pale? The fat controller turned to him. You've seen this man, Mr. Tipper? Tom nodded. The other night, as I was making my deliveries, I saw a man sitting on a bench near to where my van was parked. He didn't seem to have a letter on him, but he looked exactly as Percy described. That was the night before Mrs. Perry's initial call to my chief. Everyone was silent. Well, said Mrs. Perry at last, how do we catch this scoundrel? We should remain vigilant tonight, said Tom. There's a chance he may show up at the harbor or on my route again, if he had a letter. We could stop him in the act. Then I shall be at the harbor tonight, said Mrs. Perry sternly, to catch this cretin myself. I'd better not find that any of you are part of this, she said, and pointed at Percy, his crew, and Tom Tipper. She turned swiftly on her heel and strode back to her car. Sorry about her, said Jane as she ran after her mother. The fat controller, still taken aback, stared at Percy. Best be on your guard tonight, he said, and walked back to his office. Percy and his crew didn't say a word. They knew what had to be done. That evening, Percy arrived at the big harbor. Mist swirled all around, and he felt cold and uncomfortable. Still, he was determined to find the man. His driver and firemen helped load the post vans, keeping their eyes on the workmen and the surrounding area. When they finished, they went to speak with the ship's crew about the odd occurrences. Percy was squinting to see through the mist, looking for any signs of the strange man. He heard a sound. Glancing across the harbor, he noticed the men readying the flying kipper. With a sigh of relief, he turned back. "Oh!" he cried, for there was the man right beside him.
I suppose you're the one behind those letters, then?
Percy scowled, regaining composure. The man nodded, his expression blank.
Well, I don't know who you think you are, Percy went on, but I don't think Mr. Perry would much appreciate you making jokes in his name.
The man said nothing. Instead, he pointed at himself.
Yes, you, Percy huffed. Mr. Perry!
The man pointed insistently at himself. Percy was confused.
Gerald?
Percy and the man looked to the station. Mrs. Perry and Jane came walking towards them. Suddenly, it dawned on Percy. The man was Mr. Perry. At the sight of his wife and daughter, Mr. Perry finally broke a smile. "Hi, Dad," Jane whispered, tears forming in her eyes. Mr. Perry held his hand over his heart, smiling broadly. Then he turned to his wife.
"It's so nice to see you again,"
Mrs. Perry smiled as the tears fell from her eyes. "You look just as you did leaving on the boat that day. I love you, dear." Mr. Perry blew a kiss to her, then turned and started walking. He stopped when he reached Percy's buffers. He turned towards the little green engine, and though no sound came out, he seemed to mouth the words, "Thank you."
"You're very welcome, sir,"
Percy smiled softly. With that, Mr. Perry turned and faded into the night air as he walked down the pier.
All were silent. "I'm sorry for my accusatory tone," Mrs. Perry said at last. "My husband sent me letters every week while he was fighting in the war, never missed a beat. But one week," she sighed, "a letter didn't come. That's when I knew something was wrong." She paused to collect herself. "It seems he wanted to be sure I finally got the last letters. I apologize for thinking you and Mr. Tipper were playing a joke. It seems Gerald felt you two were best suited to deliver them to me. I read them both before we left, and they were the most beautiful letters I've ever received." Percy's crew appeared. They had seen everything as they came off the ship. "May we offer you a ride home, ma'am?" asked the driver. "I think Jane and I are going to stay a while by the sea," smiled Mrs. Perry. "But thank you ever so much for the offer." The driver smiled and tipped his cap. "Very well, ma'am. Good night. Come on, old boy," he said, turning to Percy. "We've got post to deliver." Percy whistled goodbye as he set off out of the harbor. He was glad to have helped Mr. Perry, even if it had been unknowingly, and he knew that somewhere he was smiling down upon his wife and daughter. He puffed off into the cool evening air, excited to tell Tom Tipper the news.
This video is not made for kids. It is for older fans and adults only. So fuck off and enjoy the video.
Track maintenance is not the most glamorous job. The engines considered it slow, monotonous and dull. Fergus was the exception. He relished helping the workmen replace old rails with ballast, finding it most satisfying. "You can't do it right on the wrong rails," he'd say. "Without this work, your treasured express couldn't run." The other engines rolled their eyes. If you asked them, Fergus was more than welcome to it. One evening, Fergus was prepared to take the maintenance train down Edwards Line. Tracks between Lower Sudbury and Upper Brendam needed to be replaced. Workmen loaded their tools into a van, behind which Fergus coupled 2 trucks of ballast and a flatbed of new rails and sleepers. When all was ready, he pushed the train down the line. By the time they'd reached the station, a dense fog hung in the air. Fergus's lamp shone brightly, and the men set up the lights to illuminate the sight. As they worked, Fergus's eyes wandered. The station was dark, and the crossing gates creaked gently. The low chuckle broke Fergus's trance. In front of the flatbed was a van. It bore a very devious grin, and its eyes were fixed on him intently. "Drained," he thought. "I don't remember putting a van there." "Fergus, you left our tool van behind." Fergus glanced at the workman beside him. "I did not," he insisted. "It was right at the front of the train." "Well, it's not there now," replied the workman. "Perhaps you should check this van." Fergus stopped short. The van was gone. "We need our tools," grumbled the workman, losing his patience. "Take us back to the yard at once." When they returned to Edward Station, they found Boko and the missing tool van. "It's not like you to leave trucks behind," remarked Boko. "I didn't leave it behind," Fergus protested. He stopped again. At the back of the goods shed sat a grinning van, shrouded in the darkness. "Would you like me to take the maintenance train?" Boko offered. "You seem distracted." Fergus looked back to the shed once more. The van was gone. I'm fine," he insisted. "The fog must be playing tricks with my eyes. Anyhow, we must be off at once." With the tool van now in tow, Fergus left the yard once more. For an engine known for his focus on the task at hand, his mind thought only of the strange van. He kept a watchful eye all the way up the line. Now that they were properly equipped, the men worked fast. They replaced the rails at Lower Sudbury and slowly worked their way up along the hill towards Upper Brendel. All the while, Fergus was quiet. "Not to worry, old boy," comforted his driver. "We're all a bit forgetful sometimes." Fergus didn't hear his driver's words. He was squinting through the fog towards the head of the train. In front of the ballast truck was a barely visible grin. Then came a sudden rush of wind. Fergus shut his eyes tight as he braced the gale. "Watch out!" Fergus opened one eye to identify the source of the noise, only to find himself face to face with the van and its awful smirk. "I don't know who you are," Fergus bellowed, "but I've had..." Suddenly, Fergus was being pushed down the hill. His brakes screamed as he tried to hold the train, the sound mixing with the howling of the wind and the vile cackling of the van. Fergus shut his eyes, straining with all of his might. With one last effort, he stopped at the bottom of the hill. He opened his eyes, and once again, the van was gone. By morning, the fog had cleared, and Boko arrived with the breakdown train. The workman spoke to Fergus. "That was some mighty wind. It blew one of the ballast trucks over, and sent it toppling down the hill." "Wind can't blow a loaded truck off the rails," Fergus grunted. "And where is that other van?" "Fergus, we keep telling you, there was no other van, except for the one for our tools. Now, we must get this mess cleaned up." "I'll find that van and wipe the smug smirk off its face," grunted Fergus. "No one interrupts my work." "You're not likely to find it," Boko chuckled dryly, "for it doesn't exist." "Whatever do you mean?" "The railwaymen have always been superstitious about the number 13, explained Boko. "But that doesn't just apply to engines. When a batch of wagons were built, the 13th was always treated with apprehension." "Superstitions are nothing but tish-tosh," huffed Fergus. Boko ignored him and continued. "I heard of a particularly unlucky van, supposedly the 13th in its batch, and misfortune certainly followed it. One night, an engine derailed while moving it into some old sidings. When the crew returned with a crane, the van had, well, vanished." "And?" Fergus urged. "Some say it was broken up," finished Boko, "while others say it was a trickster, roaming the rails in pursuit of mischief. When things go wrong without reason, it's likely the work of the 13th van. Many dismiss it, but you know what you saw." Fergus said nothing. As far-fetched as poltergeist seemed, he couldn't explain how the van moved and disappeared on its own accord. He continued his work with the maintenance crews, but was more focused and alert than ever. He would never admit to believing in ghosts, but every foggy night he remains on guard, lest he received a visit from the 13th van.